What's up, everyone? You're listening to Beats by Jer. I'm your host, Jared Harris. Today, I am excited, dare I say, delighted, to be joined by my friend, radio producer, podcast host, journalist, and now author, Aaron Badgley, who just released his first book, Dark Horse Records, the story of George Harrison's Post-Beatles record label, on January 26th of this year via Sonic Bond Publishing. As the title suggests, Badgley's narrative follows Harrison from his time at Apple Records as he transitioned out of both the Beatles and the 1960s into the following decade as he started his own label while also expanding his experience as a producer. Through the formation of Dark Horse Records, Badgley extensively traces the releases that would come from the label along with Harrison's involvement. Additionally, he focuses on the successes and challenges that running a label posed to Harrison as Dark Horse transitioned out of the early 70s. Through this, Badgley paints a picture of Harrison as the Beatle who was invigorated by unknown artists and sought to share that excitement with the world. By doing so, a piece of the mystery and mysticism that surround Harrison is revealed that further reaffirms why he remains my favorite Beatle. Badgley brings a truly unique perspective to this story. His voice as a writer is equally academic as it is that of a passionate fan. Most impressively, however, was his ability to conduct a series of interviews compiling a wealth of primary evidence into a narrative that has never been documented so critically. Here is my conversation with Aaron Badgley. Aaron Badgley, welcome to this episode of Beats by Jared. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. This is great. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So today we're going to be focusing on your first book, Dark Horse
Yeah.
Records, the story of George Harrison's record label. Before we get into the book, of course, so let's talk about the road that took you to this point. You've been connected with music all of your life. Could we talk
Yeah.
about your love for music?
I'll tell you the truth. When I was born, I was very sick and I was in hospital for a year and for my first year of life. And I had a nurse who I met later on in life, and she was from Barbados. And she used to bring a reel-to-reel tape deck to the Oshawa General Hospital. She used to play ska. And she would walk me around carrying me, and I would love the music. So when I went home with my mom, she said, if he gets fussy, put on music. And that's the way it's been to this day. If I get fussy, my wife just puts on an album. No, I'm just kidding. But I've been around music all my life. I don't play an instrument. My brothers do, and my parents did, but I chose to just listen. And I got into radio, and I worked in radio for about 83 to 87. Well, I've never been out of radio. Even when I was going to school and doing other things, I've always had a radio show, and I always had a foot in music. So that's it. And I started writing for magazines in the early 90s. I wrote for a magazine called Lexicon, and I was covering the Canadian new wave scene here in Canada. So it was cool.
There's a lot to unpack there. I I find it so interesting because like I have read so much of your work before your book,
Yeah.
and you have such a knowledgeable passion for music, and it's so interesting when you meet people that aren't musicians but they have that same excitement for the
Yeah.
for listening to music to that degree. Um like it's so cool that that comes from that. I'm assuming you don't like remember the ska music. These are stories that you were told later.
I don't remember, but I do remember being really little and really liking the first concert I ever saw. Not that he was ska, but my mom took me to see Harry Belafonte when I was
Wow.
4. And the opening act, I still remember her, was Miriam Makeba. And that left a lasting impression on me. And I've always liked that kind of rhythmic music. And I come from a very left-wing family. My mother would explain the social leanings and some of the lyrics of some of the songs. But from I've always had music on. Honestly, like it's just been a big passion. And then when I was 6, my brother was dating a girl up the street. Her name was Lorraine Allen, and she gave me an album called Beatlemania with the Beatles, and I just lost it. I thought this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and became my lifelong obsession with the Fab Four. Because they were still together. This would have been '69, and my brother bought me Abbey Road shortly after. And so I thought, this can't be the same band. Look at the covers. There's no way that these four guys, all my loving, it's the same for guys doing I Want You, She's So Heavy. But they were. It fascinated me
It's
to
such
know, like,
a crazy evolution that
oh,
happens within less than a decade.
oh, 7 years. I mean,
Yeah.
you think about it. 63, they're doing I Want to Hold Your Hand. 66, they're doing Tomorrow Never Knows. What the hell?
It's absurd the development in their songwriting and the direction they took. It's crazy. There's like
Yeah,
so many artists that are still discovering their sound by the point that they're almost at a decade. And the Beatles had discovered their sound, put a bookend into it, and then discovered their next sound. And then I would
yeah,
say put a bookend in that, and then, went into that final phase of like the very compositional conclusion to their career.
yeah.
It's incredible. It's inspiring. It's so impressive.
I was reading a book by Stephen King, and I'm because I love reading, and he said in the book, to appreciate the Beatles, you really have to start at Please Please Me and work your way through, because the evolution's so quick and so fast that you miss like the Rubber Soul period, or you miss the Revolver period, even Help, the album Help. So yeah, when you look back on this body of work that they did, just insane that they could do that,
Absolutely.
and the sheer volume they put out in 7 years,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
two albums a year.
Um, Before we get more into the Beatles, let's bring it back to you. Uh, what radio stations did you work for?
So I started working at CKAR in Oshawa and CKQT in Oshawa, True Radio, and then I was doing freelance for Q107, Chum FM, Chum AM. And what I did was, when I was going to college, Centennial College for radio and TV, I got hired on when I was 18, 17 to radio at CKAR. And my job was producing radio shows. At 17, I was producing radio shows, and I was producing things like Scottish Review and Continental Breakfast and Canadian Sunrise, but they gave me the freedom to do things like I interviewed the Spoons when their album Talk Back came out, and I did a whole show about the Spoons. And then I got to interview OMD. I interviewed New Order when they played Toronto back in '85, I think it was. And I would build radio shows around these artists, and then I would sell them to Coca-Cola, and they would get syndicated. And it was kind of cool that I was, doing this
That's
when
yeah, that's really cool.
I just wanted to talk to the artist. I got to hang out with OMD for a day, and I'll never forget. I was so nervous meeting them. They said, "Well, come to our hotel room," and I did. And I was just shaking like a leaf. And they made me tea, and they were lovely guys. And then they took me to the show, and I met like Robert Palmer, and I think there was the power station that was opening, and Nick Kershaw. So I just started doing a lot of radio, and I had this deal with Coca-Cola that I did a daily show called Inside Music, um, that I kind of packed in when I went back to university to go do. I went into social work, and I just kind of put it all out because it was hard work, and I was getting frustrated with Coca-Cola because they were telling me, well, you can't play Elvis Costello because he's a bit too left, or let's not play too many of the Red Wedge Tour shows. And I was like, well, I'm not interested. I don't want to play Foreigner. Nothing against Foreigner, but they were all getting played. I wanted to play artists that weren't getting the attention they deserved, in my opinion.
Interesting. And I mean, you could make the case that that's why you are so involved in music still, I bet, right? From whether it was radio or writing about music, right? Aaron and I both write for the Spill magazine. Aaron is, I would say, from my understanding, the greatest contributor in terms of volume and in terms of quality, right? He's just
Wow.
absolutely fantastic. And you have your own podcast as well, correct?
Well, I have three radio shows. I do two shows with Tony Stewart, and they started as podcasts, and they've morphed into radio shows. Actually, they're on the air in Winnipeg and Newfoundland. And
Amazing.
yeah, and then I have a show. Now that's more oldies. Like we look at the history of music 54 to 80. And then I have a show on Guelph Radio, and that's all new music. I just play new bands, a lot of mostly Canadian. I'll be honest with you. I'd say 70% is Canadian. So, which I love because I discover bands I don't even discover through Spill. Like I just discovered a band from Vancouver called Apollo Ghost, and they're blowing me away. They're just fantastic. It's like,
Oh,
whoa,
cool. I'll
this
have
is
to check
great.
them out.
Yeah, they're really cool. And so it's been fun. I really love talking about music. I love listening to music. I just and you know what, Gerard, it's important for me to play stuff that doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. So, and just because I like it, not because I'm arrogant, I think I know more than I don't, but it's like, this is a great song. And it happens, I'll have friends come over and I'll go, just listen, see what you think. And they go, oh, we're going to get this. This is great, So,
Yeah, it's such a nice thing to be able to share music, and I really value the friendships I have with people when they share music with me, right? Like
me too.
it's such a nice thing to be able to share with people and get excited about.
I have a
Uh,
daughter who's living in Ireland and she's 23 now, 24. And she sends me music all the time. Actually, she's 25. She sends me music all the time. Well, to me, she's still 12, but she lives in Dublin. And she like, have you heard Lankum? Have you heard Mary Wallopers? Have you heard Oxen? Have you? And I'm like, no. And I'm discovering a whole other world of music through her, and she, on the other hand, has discovered a whole world. Like she just went to see the Stranglers last night.
oh,
So
cool. Cool.
I raised her well. I raised her well.
Yeah, you did a fantastic job there.
Well, my wife
Um,
did a lot too, but I'm just saying.
it's it's a team role.
Team effort, team effort. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, you're incredibly involved in music your whole life. At what point did you want to write a book? Like, was there ever a moment that you knew that that's where you wanted to go? Because it seems like you've spent this career, and let's call it a career in the sense that it's been numerous careers, right? But all within music. Um, you spent this lifetime writing and sharing and discussing music. Was there a concrete point when you knew you wanted to write a book, or did you just fall into it?
So when I was a kid, like really little, my brother gave me his old typewriter. I was about 10, and I actually reviewed every Beatle album I owned at the time. So I sat there with a piece of paper, a little review, and I wrote a book about the Beatles. It was very childish. I've always wanted to write a book, but what happened was, I'll tell you the truth, I was interviewing Kenneth Womack, who has written several books about the Beatles. I was interviewing him for Spill, and he said, I've read your articles. What have you ever thought about writing a book? I said, well, yeah, but everything's been told. He said, no, well, there's things that haven't been. Give it some thought. And I've always been fascinated by record labels. I mean, I still will I love the design. I love the whole story behind them. And I was always interested in Dark Horse and Apple, and Ringo had a label called Ringo Records. So I said to him, I go, what do you think about writing a book about Dark Horse Records? And he goes, oh, it's never been done. There's no research. Good luck. I said, yeah, okay. So, well, there's very little out there. I mean, when you start digging into about these artists, good luck finding stuff. So, so I just like, yeah, I'll see where this goes. So I started writing the book, and you know, I'm not a big person on technology, but it's nice to go on Facebook and say, hey, weren't you in the Manjiva? Would you mind talking to me? I'm writing this book on Dark Horse. No one said no. So I interviewed all the bands on the label, including members of Ravi Shankar's orchestra. They were in India.
Wow.
They were lovely. And they were 90s, and their memory was just bang on. So everyone was really nice about, then I got to interview like people I love, like Chris Spedding and Tom Scott. And a lot what they told me I didn't put in the book because it wasn't directly about Dark Horse. Like Tom Scott, it was so funny. He's a great saxophone player. And I said to him, before we just talk about Dark Horse, I love your solo and listen to what the man said. And he goes, I'll tell you how that came about, Aaron. Paul called me. I went into the studio. McCartney said, here's what I'm working on. What do you think? And he goes, well, what about this, Paul? And he played this thing. McCartney goes, great. I'll cut you a check. And he goes, what do you mean? Well, that was what I wanted. Perfect. One shot. He didn't even know he was being recorded. And that's the solo. That's all the record. It was one take, one shot, one done and done. And so listening to these stories, and Tom Scott worked with Joni Mitchell and all these people. I was just like, whoa. And he worked with Ravi Shankar. So everyone was very giving with their stories. And slowly but surely, I started building the story about the label, and it just started becoming, in my mind, anyways, it became alive. And the other thing is, this is a period of Harrison's life that no one talks about. If you read Beatle books, they'll talk about all things what's past, Bangladesh concert, living in the material world. They kind of fast forward to like Cloud Nine, but there was a lot that went on from 74 to Cloud Nine. And I kind of wanted to get that across too, that Harrison was remarkably prolific and put out the best letter I got after I put the book out. Someone wrote me a letter and said, I never knew Gone Tropo existed by George Harrison. So I went out and bought it. It's my favorite George Harrison album. I thought, thank you. That's all I wanted to do was just say, hey, man, there's more to Harrison than all things must pass. And there is. There's a lot more to this guy, right? So,
Yeah, you know what? I would argue that he is my favorite Beatle.
yeah.
I mean, it's such a silly thing, but like going back to like the 60s where everyone had like their favorite Beatle, right? Like George to me was always such a mystery because there was so much like he was the underdog to Lennon McCartney. He was the one that was a little more off to the side and like not reclusive, but a lot quieter. And it just interests me and like getting to hear his like lead songwriting on like something or his solo records. It was always so interesting, and I always wanted to hear more of him in the Beatles. Um,
Well,
then you
but
told me
that's
about
yeah, I was going to say that's why he called the label Dark Horse. Exactly what you just said. Because he was like because in England, Dark Horse has a different meaning than it does here. In England, it means you're moving around in the dark. You're kind of the mysterious one. So
Mhm.
that's why he called
Okay.
the Dark Horse. So, anyways, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. This is your interview, your conversation. Um, so you mentioned your first memory of the Beatles back in you first got into them when they were just kind of ending things off, right? You were saying
Yeah,
60, was it 68, 69?
yeah. My older brother. I'm the youngest of five boys. And I had a brother that lived in Toronto and went to the university. He'd bring me home Beatle records. He's the one that dated Lorraine. And I'll never forget, he brought me, he said, well, we're going to go see a movie. And I said, okay, what are we going to go see? He goes, Let It Be. And we got to the theater and it was literally 2 weeks after the Beatles split. And he goes, well, they split up, right? And I just was beyond consolable. I was like, no, I can't, no. But then 2 weeks later, the Bloody Monkey split up. So there you go.
Um, I'm curious, what was the first moment that left you absolutely enamored with them? Was it that first listen, or was there something else that you heard a bit later?
I think what it was my brother bought me Revolver, and I was hearing things on that record that scared me, that intrigued me, and I couldn't believe that four guys did this because even from the opening of the Taxman, the one, two, three, four, and then it ends with Tomorrow Never Knows. But in between, you got the story of Eleanor Rigby, you get For No One, which is just an incredible piece of music. And you get this kid's song, Yellow Submarine, just before you go into She Said, I Know What It's Like to Be Dead. And that was the aha moment for me. And I thought I would have been, I got that for Christmas in 1970. And that was it. And even though the Beatles had split up by this point, I had to get every record. I had to hear everything they did because that album to this day blows me away. In fact, I just
I
bought a new copy
I
because
love Revolver. I love that
it's
album
just
so
good stuff.
much.
It's
Uh,
my favorite. It's my favorite.
I don't know if it's my favorite, but it is definitely that turning point that I think is like so incredibly important for their trajectory, you know?
I'm always envious of people who've never heard it and then they hear it for the first time. The other album that kind of freaked me out. I am because it was such a big thrill. The other album was the White Album. So
Okay.
I saved up. Had a paper route and I saved up and I bought the White Album. And so you brought up a point. Here's Harrison doing While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Long, 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 Piggies, Savoy Truffle, a song about a box of chocolates. But yeah, Revolution 9, Revolution 1, and one of the most diabolical sequencing of all time on any album. You have you have Cry Baby Cry, Revolution 9, and then Good Night. You're like, there cannot be a good night after these last two songs, boy. So those two moments with the Revolver album just floored me. And I always say to my girls, I have two daughters, I go, the first time you hear it, you never forget it. And they were the same. I remember my daughter called me up and she said, wow, we were just sitting and listening to Revolver, Dad, you're right. Like, this is just crazy album. I said, yeah, it's great. The Indian music, it shouldn't have worked, right? Because it's all over the map. Because it's everything under the sun in one album, but yet it's a very cohesive album.
Absolutely.
From
It's so funny that you say you wish you can go back to hearing it for the first time. You're envious of people that haven't heard it because
yeah,
I hear like Hendrix Voodoo Child, and guitar playing like that is so much more commonplace. I mean, nobody is doing what Hendrix did, but that over the top, that tone, it's been done since, and I'm so envious of people that got to hear that for the first time before it had ever been replicated by other people. You know what I mean? And it's like hearing that solo to me is like, if I had a time machine, I would love to go back to 69 to hear that before hearing other things like that. Um, it's just such a interesting thought to, our the way we perceive music, having heard other things that have come after it, just changes the way we think and feel about these things.
Joe Jackson used to write a blog on his website. He wrote exactly about that. He said,
Oh yeah?
yeah, exactly what you just said. Everything, it was like you got to try to separate what you know now from what was known then. And walking into it, McCartney always talks about walking into a club in England called Speakeasy, and he does this thing where he goes, you walk in and there's Hendrix on the stage, and you just kind of go, what is this? Like, I don't know what to do with it.
Hmm.
Because it's
Hmm.
so wacky, right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing. I agree with you. I would love a time machine to go back and experience. I want to hold your hand on Sullivan because that changed the world. It literally
Absolutely. Absolutely.
overnight changed the world. So yeah,
What
I'm
is
with you.
it what is it about the Beatles to you that makes them so special?
It's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer. I'm gonna try. For obviously for me, it's the music, lyrics, but they symbolize something. I used to watch the four of them, and I just finished Phil Manzanera's autobiography, and he said in the book, you would look at the Beatles and you saw four best friends working together for one aim. Now, this is before we knew all the infighting and all that. I just thought they were like Mick Jagger called them a four-headed monster. And I don't think he's wrong. Like, they were so tight. And I think I envied the friendship they had. It was almost like a mini gang. And as a kid growing up in a small town where I really just didn't fit in, it was good to hear a band like the Beatles who made it very big by not fitting in. So they symbolized a lot to me, and I'm probably reading far too much into their history, but their music and the way they sang, they wrote. You put on Magical Mystery Tour, then you put on A Hard Day's Night, you just don't know what to expect, and then you bring in their solo records, and it's like an epiphany, right? Uh, so to this day, like I get excited. It's funny. I was driving at lunch and I heard The Night Before off of Help. I haven't heard that song probably in about a month or two. Wow, that's a good song. I go home and get the Help album out. So there's something about it. It's like they're very. And I thought the other thing I loved about the Beatles was they were very inclusive. It didn't matter your size, your weight, your anything. It's just you were part of the beat, and I love that about them, and the fact that they wouldn't play to a segregated audience. And I thought, good for them. Like they were the first band to say, no, we'll play, but we're not. There's not going to be any segregation here, and that was pretty revolutionary too in its time, right? And
Absolutely.
so yeah, all those things, and the fact that, as Paul McCartney says, 90% of their songs are about love and peace, and we could sure use that today, right?
For
Just
sure.
saying. Just saying.
What would you like? what would you say makes them so enduring? Because you grew up with the Beatles, right?
Yeah.
And you've spent your life listening to them, but I teach high school kids, and I had a handful of students last semester obsessing over the Beatles, and it was
Really?
so, yeah, it was so strange. It was so interesting. And it was, despite having access to all this information, they were speculating and asking questions to each other, like, did you know this about the Beatles? Did you know that? And it was so unique. And then I would kind of like, as they were working and they'd be chatting about these things, I'd kind of like be like, oh yeah, like what about this? And they're like, what are you talking? It was so different. It was so unique. What to you do you think makes their legacy so enduring? I mean, like, we're over half a century since they split up.
Yeah. And they just came out with a new record. I remember seeing
That's my
on
next
TikTok.
question.
Oh, we'll come back to that then. I think what's endearing about the Beatles, enduring and endearing, I think just solid songwriting. But I also think underneath it all were these four guys that on paper should never have made it as big as they did, and yet they did. And they left more questions than answers. And I know I was asked to speak to a school last year via Zoom about the McCartney death clues. And these kids were
That's the
just
that's the question after this, after the next one. Keep going, keep
it's
going. It's okay.
it's almost like the Beatles are almost like a myth that actually existed. Like
That's a really
it,
unique perspective.
but it's true. Like if you think about them, it's almost like there's this myth about these four guys, and they came together. They had lousy instruments at the beginning, and yet they made this great sound. And I've been reading a lot of autobiographies. I read Ozzy Osbourne. I just finished reading Brian Johnson, Phil Manzanera, and they all talk about hearing "Love Me Do" for the first time because they're that age, and they said it hit them. And then there's like I just read an article today, Ariana Grande, who I don't know much about, but she's just a collector. She loves the Beatles, or her favorite band. And I thought, I don't hear them in her music, but that's okay. She just loves the Beatles. That's great. And there's a band in Ireland that are really young, and they're very big in Ireland, called Mary Wallopers, and they're like, we love the Beatles, but they're all trad. They just do trad music, but they're like, oh, the Beatles are the best. So I think there's something in their harmonies and the melodies. I think the lyrics and the music just touch your core for most people, not everybody. I mean, you get those odd people who are, I don't like the Beatles. You're like, yeah, really? I have a friend who's a musician, and I love he has a joke. Do you want to hear his joke?
Yeah, go for it.
Two types of people in the world: those who love and are influenced by the Beatles, and liars. So
I think to say that you don't like the Beatles, I mean, of course you're welcome to like whatever you like, but you're certainly
well,
going to like something or someone that was directly influenced by the Beatles. It's
absolutely.
it's kind of like that old saying, I want to say it was about the Velvet Underground, that not many
Yeah,
people bought their records, but everyone that did started a band.
it's true.
Um, Certainly for the Beatles, that was tenfold, hundredfold, you know what I mean? For both buying records and people starting bands.
Yeah.
Um, while we are on the topic of just Beatles lore, what was your thoughts on Now and Then?
I loved it. I thought it was Beatles, and I remember my daughter sending me the one in Ireland. She kept sending me clips of people crying as they're listening to it, and they're young kids. And she said to me something interesting. She said, Dad, I can experience something. I can experience a new Beatles song in my life that I never thought I would do. And that was so meaningful to her that she got to hear a brand new Beatles song the day it came out. And she said, it must have been like when you heard Hey Jude for the first time, or Ballad of John and Yoko, or Get Back. I'm thinking, oh, yeah, it's up there. I mean, it was up there. But I loved the song. I think Lennon would have loved it. I think McCartney and Ringo did a great job. I thought, I know that they cleaned up tapes. I know they didn't use AI the way people think they did. But I mean, what did you think of the song? I'm just curious because you're a
I thought it
musician. So
was
what?
I thought it was really cool. Yeah, I
Yeah,
thought it was
good.
such a nice way to kind of bookend that career, and
I agree.
and especially how they packaged it with their first single ever, and like just that
Beautiful.
it was a really nice coming full circle. I like that they said that this is the final one, and they kind of we still have two of them there here to do that. I thought it was
Yeah.
really cool.
I also, the fact that Paul McCartney, um, or his guitarist actually showed online the original cassette. On one side it said now and then, on the other side it said for Paul.
Mm.
So the fact that wanted Paul to either hear it, or it was about Paul, or it was, it was. I mean, look, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be honest and say the first time I heard it, I cried like a baby. Then the video just killed me. Oh my gosh, that video murdered me. But I loved it. I think it's up there. To me, it's a song I love. I listen to it a lot. I still
Yeah,
do.
it's really great. It's really
Yep.
great. Okay. Paul McCartney, our Paul is dead. I don't buy into a lot of conspiracy theories, but this one is so fascinating because it's survived. It's endured with the Beatles, right? Like
Oh, still going strong.
yeah, yeah, like the connections on the Abbey Road cover, the OPP badge on his Sergeant Pepper's uniform. What are your takes on
You
this
know,
on
I
this on this theory?
I always was intrigued by the line in Glass Onion. Here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. And that's an interesting line from John. It's like, well, okay, what are you talking about? Because that predates the whole rumor. But there's John singing it. I think it was a bizarre coincidence that happened, and it got a life of its own. And it's I mean, I'm one of those idiots that I used to work in radio, and I worked at a radio station, and a friend of mine, a very dear friend, we decided one night to listen to Revolution 9 backwards. I don't recommend it to anybody because it's
Songs are
absolutely,
songs are meant to be listened to backwards.
yeah, this one, no. I mean, I thought we raised the devil. Like, it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. But you hear the clues, you hear the guy car crash, you hear the flames, you hear the screaming, get me out, get me out. It's a creepy, I don't think, obviously, I don't think he died. Obviously, I think he's alive and well. Did the Beatles do it intentionally? Well, just remember one thing. I'm not going to answer that with a yes or no, but I will say, the Beatles did little tricks like Paperback Writer. Everyone thinks they're singing Paperback Writer in the background. They're not. They're singing Frere Jacques. Listen carefully. The George and John are singing Frere Jacques, Frere Jacques. So they wanted to see if people were paying attention. And don't forget that McCartney in 66 wrote a song for another band, refused to take credit for it. It came out as Bernard W. Webb. And it was them kind of saying, well, are people paying attention, or are they just buying because it's the Beatles? They would, Day Tripper has the infamous, is it a big teaser, or is it the other words? So they like to play with your minds a bit. Now, would they go all out and pretend McCartney's dead? I hope not. However, the clues are pretty intriguing.
It's fun. It's fun. And
It's
I
fun.
like
It's
to I
also
like
scary.
I like to imagine that Paul heard that and was like, I'm not gonna tell them I didn't die. You know what I mean? Like let's play into that a bit and have some fun with it.
Well, the funny thing was that the other thing that fueled the fire was he disappeared, because this is at the time of the Beatles breaking up, and he had gone to
Mhm.
install. And Life sent photographers out to get a picture. What does McCartney do? He throws a bucket of water at them. Well, gee, Paul, like, this is not. So he had to kind of apologize and do an interview and say, "No, I'm quite alive and well. Thank you very much." But and McCartney parodied it. I don't know if you ever seen. He did a live album in '94, and it's called Paul is Live, and he's walking across Abbey Road with a dog. But he has the original Abbey Road with the Volkswagen and the people, and it's
Oh,
very
cool.
fun.
No, I don't think I've heard that one.
Yeah, look it up. It's very good. Paul is Live, and it's a live album. It's a great live album, actually, in my opinion.
Cool. Cool. You said Revolver is your favorite album. I am curious if you
Hmm.
have a favorite Beatle. I shared mine.
You did share yours. Uh, I feel like I'm gonna give you a dad answer. I love them all equally for different reasons.
Okay, okay.
No, it's I don't have a favorite Beatle. I feel like I'm betraying one if I say, but I mean, I've gone through different phases. When I was a kid, Ringo was my very favorite. I loved Ringo. Still do. Seen him 15 times. I love his new EPs. Love him. But what do I listen to most? While I was writing the book, I listened to nothing but Harrison, and I loved every second of it. But of late, I've been really going to the McCartney catalog and really devouring. Ram, for example, I just can't seem to get enough of that album. I don't know why. But so I don't have one, but it changes. Like some days it's definitely McCartney. Like my wife will say, well, you're clearly a McCartney guy. I go, well, today I am. Tomorrow I could be a John guy, like it's and they're putting out a box set in May of Mind Games. So John's gonna be my favorite for a little while.
So, Dark Horse Records,
Yeah,
your first ever, your new book,
yeah.
um, is a critical deep dive into Harrison in the near aftermath of the end of the Beatles. You've already said why you kind of went this direction. It just had never been done. Um, the book in itself really focuses on George and Dark Horse equally, I would say. Was there a thought to kind of separate these? Did you find it difficult? Was it just kind of something that you could not, like the two are inseparable to each other?
Well, it's inseparable, but at the same time, I refuse to go into too much of Harrison's personal life. I didn't think that told the story of the label, but because he was Dark Horse, we had to kind of the royal one has to kind of look at what was going on for him because everything he was doing was going back into Dark Horse. I mean, he had the hope that he'd have his own little cottage industry. He had his own recording studio. The records would sell enough to pay for the next record and so forth. Um, and he had his hand in it. When I spoke to Derek Green, who worked for A&M Records, who was in charge of promoting Dark Horse, he said, Harrison picked every single of every artist on that label. He would listen to the album, but that should be the single. He was very involved. Whether he produced Splinter, he produced Shankar, he produced some of Kenny Burke, but he really was involved, and yet he wasn't. So all the musicians told me he gave them free rein. You record what you want, we'll make it work. So it was an interesting thing that he was doing. So yeah, it was. I tried to separate the two, and then when he kind of shut down other artists, it just became his label. I had to kind of talk about Harrison, right? So
Hmm.
from the George Harrison album on, it was really just about him, and which is fine. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it was a different label at that point.
Of course, of course. It's such a niche piece of history.
Oh yeah,
I had never heard of Dark Horse. I didn't know George had his own label. I didn't know Ringo had one as well. Um, and from your conversation, you were saying that you were kind of drawn to it simply because it hadn't been done. Was
yeah.
that, that's such a daunting thing, right? You had to you are this source for all of these things now, right?
I don't know about that, but
We're,
well, I was at a Beatles convention in February, and they kept introducing me as the dark horse and the expert on dark horse. I guess like I'm not an expert. Like I researched, I wrote a book. I'm far from an expert, but I'm hoping that someone will read the book and want to build on it. I think there's still a lot to say about the label. In fact, it's still going. Danny, his son's running it, and it's not gone. It did for a while. It disappeared for a while, but it's back, and you know, it's it was just such an interesting story to me. And the fact that you had never heard of it, I love that. And that makes me happy that you read the book. Oh my gosh, Harrison did like that's great because just when you think like I love reading a Beatle book going, I never knew. I'm just doing some research. I'm working on my next book and there was like, oh, I never knew that. That's cool. And you start doing research and deep dives and going to the libraries and stuff. And it's great. I love doing that. Love doing that. And I interviewed someone for the new book, and he was telling me stories that I don't think anyone's ever heard. So very excited. And the guy who provided me a lot of photos for the book, which no one's ever seen before, he said to me, "Look, if you do that, I'm doing a book on Ringo Starr." He goes, "I got tons of pictures of Ringo when he was in France in 75, 76, 77. They're yours if you want them."
That's
Yeah,
crazy. Yeah.
I'll take
Um,
them.
so when you were approaching this book though, did you like where there's so little information out there? You obviously knew about Dark Horse going into it, but how much of this was new information to you? How much of it was like a foundation that you already had, or did you kind of walk into this and it just seemed to the topic just kept growing deeper and deeper beyond what you imagined the story would be when you first started?
It's well, I knew about the label, and I knew I had most of the Dark Horse records, and I didn't know much about it. I thought it was. It's really funny because the publisher said, "Do you think you can get 10,000 words of this?" I said, I'm not so sure. Maybe." First draft of the book was close to 500 pages. I trimmed it back because there was
Whoa.
a lot of, well, as my wife said,
I don't remember how many pages the book was. I feel like that's like twice the length, right?
once it was twice the length. Yeah. I just kept discovering new things. I knew about the label. I knew there was a lot I didn't know. And then what I thought I knew, I didn't know. So in other words, when I was talking to the musicians, and I was like, there's some stories in there that I had no idea about. And I was always under it was this way, but then all of a sudden you go, no, actually, Aaron, what happened was you go, oh, really? Like the Jiva, who I never knew how they got to open for Fleetwood Mac. Well, Harrison's first wife's sister was married to Mick Fleetwood. Harrison and Mick Fleetwood are friends. Harrison said, look, as a favor to me and the label, take them on the road. They're on the road with Fleetwood Mac. They're doing really well. But then midpoint of the tour, everything breaks down with A&M Records, who is distributing Dark Horse, and all the records are out of the store. And Jeeva's going to record stores going, our record's not in here. What's going on? And then they get pulled off the tour like that. So I didn't know any of that stuff. That was fascinating to me because I kept thinking, how did this group not be big opening for Fleetwood Mac? I mean, come on, you're playing. This is just before Rumors. They're playing 40,000 stadium. Surely someone must have liked them. So, so that was a big epiphany, but it was just the and talking to people, but then looking at contracts and looking at some legal settlements was kind of like the whole thing between A&M Records and Warner Brothers. Again, wasn't what I thought the contract ended at A&M. No, 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 not at all. They ended the contract because they were pissed at George. And so it was a lot of stuff that I didn't know. And so I mean, as a Beatle collector, I've been collecting Dark Horse records since 75. Jared, if you saw my record collection, you'd be like, this guy's insane. So it's
I would love to see a picture of your record collection.
I'll send it to you someday. It's crazy. It's just insane because it's like, because I just thought I need to get I have all the Apple records, Dark Horse. I got everything that came out of Ringo Records. Um, so it was just a story that hadn't been told. And every time I looked in a book, I couldn't find anything. Even when you Google Dark Horse, you'd find the Wikipedia page, which was about 3 paragraphs. And I thought, there's got to be more to the story than this, you know? So
Hmm.
I love doing the research. Unfortunately, I would get lost in rabbit holes. I'd be looking at a Billboard magazine from 1976, and all of a sudden it's two in the morning. I started at 4 in the afternoon, but I just couldn't stop reading the stuff that was in Billboard and Cashbox and Rolling Stone, and then the whole British. Some of those reviews I dug up were so mean, but I thought I need to put them in the book. Like they weren't getting good reviews, so there's a
Hmm.
review.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really interesting story. And the fact that like the Wikipedia page was 3 paragraphs and you
Nothing
turned
else.
it into a 500-page book that was then edited down, but like that's like the process of researching that you had gone through, the lengths you had gone through is astounding. Um,
I was here for my wife because I'd be saying, "Did you know that in 1977, George?" She's like, "Oh, honey, just I love the Beatles. I love you, but I don't really care right now."
um, was it hard doing the research? Like, was it challenging conducting these interviews, digging up all these reviews, these original documents, finding the information yourself? Was that challenging or?
It was, but I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a kid, I had eight or nine scrapbooks of Beatle articles I would collect. And I had one for George, one for John, one for Paul, one for Ringo. So I thought, I wonder what I clipped in those. I hadn't seen those in probably 40 years. So I dug them out and I found all these reviews on George's album in British press and American press. So that was easy. Like, okay, great. And I was such a nerd when I was 12. And I but Rolling Stone magazine, this, whatever. So I could actually reference it. But the other stuff was hard to find. Stuff on Splinter, Henry McCulloch, that was the hardest because he is passed away and no one who worked on the record was around. I actually interviewed his manager, a guy named Dave Robinson. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, so I'm talking to Dave Robinson, and I said to him, I don't know, I asked him a question. He goes, well, it's kind of like when I was working with Reckless Eric. And I went, hang on, are you the Dave Robinson who owns Stiff Records? And he went, yeah. Oh, I see. So all of a sudden I'm talking on Henry McCulloch, and all of a sudden he's like, oh my gosh, this is the guy that started Stiff Records. He signed Madness, Costello. I'm like, my head's exploding now, right? And I'm trying to stay focused on Dark Horse. And meanwhile, I'm going, oh, I gotta ask him about Reckless Eric. I gotta ask him about Graham, Parker. But so yeah, it was hard because I just didn't know where, and you have to rely on people's memory. And some people are kind of going, well, I don't know. Now, I'll be honest with you, most of them, like when I interviewed Bill Elliott, who passed away shortly after I interviewed him, he was lovely and his memory was sharp as a tack and great stories about being in Splinter. And some of the comments he made, I put in the book because it just cracked me. And I talked to his wife and I said, look, I know he's passed away. Are you okay if I use this stuff? And she said, yeah, he'd love it. So, that kind of stuff happened too, because it was a process of about 3 years from beginning to end.
Like
And
research included, like everything?
yeah,
Wow.
well, yeah, research, writing, rewriting, editing, rewrite, edit. Yeah, it was a lot of work that way. And unfortunately, a couple of people passed away while I was writing the book that I'd interview, and I wanted to be respectful. I didn't want to kind of, because they're going to read it too, and I want to make sure that they're happy with it, right? So
You also don't want to, not that I get the sense that you would do this, but you don't want to appear as though that you are like almost profiting off of
right.
the involvement of people that aren't, right? Like almost sensationalizing their involvement.
Yeah, 100%. And I was honored that I got to talk to these people. I talked to a guy named Alvin Taylor, who drummed on Harrison's 33 and a Third album, but also the Stair Steps and Kenny Burke. And he was, oh my gosh, we've become very good friends. Like we still talk on Facebook.
That's
And
fantastic.
he sent me his book, his autobiography. He goes, can you edit this for me? And I'm like, Alvin, I'm not much of an editor, but I'll read it. And so there was a lot of good things happened during the course of the writing of the book, but it was hard. It was challenging just because it was a lot of it was new ground, and I'm not, who am I? I'm just some yabo who decided to try to find this stuff, and I had fun. I mean, I really, really, again, because I love music, I'm a big Roxy Music fan. And I'd be going through these British magazines from the mid-70s. I'm like, oh my gosh, here's a review for Siren. Oh, well, I gotta read this. No, focus.
I mean, on the note of breaking ground, it's just so interesting that like you like I know you said you aren't the expert, but like you really are the expert on Dark Horse Records. You collected all of these individual stories, recollections, like events, and compiled them, right? And I mean, I think that makes you an expert. I
Well,
think that if that doesn't make you an expert, I don't know what does. No one else was putting this story together before you came
oh,
along.
thank you. I'm working on this book on Ringo, and I interviewed a couple of artists on his Ringo Records label. And this one guy said to me, I have a question for you, Aaron. I said, yeah. How the hell did you know I recorded that one single on Ringo Records? Because it sold 75 copies worldwide. Because I have a copy, Doug.
Um, what's the next book about?
I'm working on two books, actually.
Okay.
One's on Ringo in the 70s, from 1970 to 1980. The other one, which I think you'll find interesting, more so than Ringo maybe, is a book about a band from Canada called Klaatu. And much like the McCartney death rumors, people thought there was a conspiracy that Klaatu were the Beatles when their first album came out. And this is a band that went from selling 100,000 copies a week in the US. Once they came out and said, we're not the Beatles, we're three guys from Toronto, went down to selling about 1,000 a week in the US. But it's an
Hmm.
interesting story.
Interesting. Yeah.
Rock band. And when they put their first album out, they refused to put credits on it. They just said written, produced, Klaatu. No photos. That's all we want.
You mentioned this in your book, correct?
And yeah.
Okay, yes. Okay. This sounds familiar, and I was like, I don't know if I read this in Dark Horse or if this was somewhere
Uh,
else. Okay.
it was all part of 76 was a mini year of Beatlemania. Because, and I know you weren't around, but those of us
I
were.
was not, no.
Because the Gotta Get You Into My Life was in the top 10. Rock and Roll Music by the Beatles, the compilation was number one. And all of a sudden, there's this band. They sound sort of like the Beatles. They're called Klaatu. Ringo appears as Klaatu on the cover of Goodnight Vienna. There's a song called Sub Rosa Subway, which has Look Up to the Skies London in Morse code at the end. And didn't Paul McCartney have a band called Wings? Wouldn't the Wings be in the sky? All these rumors. There's no credits. It sounds like the Beatles. They're the Beatles. And, it was a fascinating story. And I've been really fortunate. Again, no one's written a book about them. And I'm lucky that the band's trusting me to go into their archives and look at all the stuff they have. And I get to talk to the band and I've talked to one. I'm going to be talking to them next week. So that's what I'm working on now. And it's an interesting, again, it's one of those interesting stories that really kind of blows you away. That like it's funny.
Yeah,
And
that's really cool.
my publisher is English, British. And when I suggested it to him, I thought he's never going to go for a book on a Canadian prog rock band. And he goes, Klaatu, love them. Yay.
Nice.
So
I'm looking forward to both of those. I mean, hearing you talk about how those rumors kind of started that like those hints that people were digging up to make that
yeah.
Beatles connection. I I don't think people make connections like that anymore. I don't think people listen to music so engaged and so, looking for like clues. And maybe it's not that people aren't listening, maybe it's that musicians aren't putting Morse code at the end of, you know what I mean? Like maybe they're not giving them things to look for, but it's it's so interesting that there was a time where, we had people theorizing and digging for more musically, and maybe we just don't have that too much anymore.
Well, I think that the other sad part is that with the social media, that everything's captured now. So there was a whole bunch of bands that people thought were the Beatles in disguise, one of which was a group called Hot Legs. And they had a hit single called Neanderthal Man back in 71. And everyone thought, oh, this is the Beatles minus Paul. It's the Beatles, John, George, and Ringo with Klaus Vorman. We know this is. Well, it was 10cc. Right? And the 10cc certainly sounded like the Beatles. I'm a big 10cc fan. But it was like all these rumors, like you say, and it was a kind of a fun period where all the speculation and then in the 80s there was a lot of bands that would go under pseudonyms and put out records. Billy Bragg was famous for it. And you're kind of going, oh, is that Billy? And McCartney himself. McCartney did an album called Percy Thrills Thrillington. And it was an instrumental album of Ram. And to promote the album, he took out ads all across newspapers in England saying, Percy Thrillington will be coming to your town really soon. He's looking forward to it. Who's Percy Thrillington? And this album came out, and it's Paul. But it was completely, no one knew it was Paul at the time. I bought it at Sam the Record Man's for $1 in the bargain bin. Now, of course, it's a collector's item, but I remember my mother going, why the hell did you buy this? And go, I don't know, it's just kind of cool. But then, oh, wait, it's Paul
Oh,
McCartney.
so you bought it not knowing.
I did. Yeah, I had no idea. I thought it was
Wow.
just wacky albums some weird guy put out, but it's a good album too, by the way. But,
Yeah, cool. No, I'd never heard of that either. So interesting. Um, I'm super curious, and the fact that you're writing two more books, we can talk about this a little bit more, I think. But what is your process to writing a book? What does the typical day look when you are in the process of actively writing a book?
I'm old school, so I have an outline that I want to kind of do in each chapter, and then I tackle each chapter individually, and then once I've written all the chapters, I try to bridge it. You know what I mean? Like try to write a paragraph to kind of say, well, this is coming up next or whatever. That was how I was taught to write back in the Stone Age. And So so for the Klaatu book, I know I want to do a pre-Klaatu and then the recording of the album. The recording of the album is really interesting. So I'm doing some, I just actually talked to their manager and just kind of gather as much information, then try to find information on the internet, libraries. Um, I'm actually going to England in May, and I've got some time booked at the National Archives to look about Ringo Starr and pick up some old contracts for his label and stuff like that. So I guess I'm methodical in that I'm going to use, because I don't have a lot of time or money. So if I'm going to go there, get as much done as I humanly can, and then bring the information back and use it as I will, you know? But I'm a morning guy. I like to write in the mornings. I like to get up at 6 and write. And then, it's just I'm afternoons, I'm like, let's have a nap. But at night I write at night too, but I like writing in the morning. There's something about mornings for me. That's how I wrote the Harrison book. I was working and I'd get up at 6. Well, actually I get up at 5. I would write from 5:30 till 8:30, work, write at lunch, and then after work I'd do a bit more writing, usually editing. And I got so much done in those hours. Again, I'm a dad. My kids weren't at home. Well, one wasn't home. So I just kind of wanted to, not take away time from my kids. And I just wanted to kind of be available to my wife and stuff. So if I wrote from 5:30 to 8:30, no one's up anyway, except for the cat, who can be a nuisance. But I should have given her credit in the book because I'm sure if there's any mistakes, I'm going to blame her. But so that's my process. I just kind of have to. I had to know what I want to say in that chapter, then try. And truth is, I would in the Harrison book, I wanted to say certain things. I couldn't if I couldn't find info, or if I couldn't find verification that I got left out. I wouldn't put anything in that I could not back up with. Here is proof. Like it was really important to me to have that when you read the book, that everything there's a reference, there's something to kind of say this is what you know what I mean. There's no speculation.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
I
important.
think that really speaks to the quality of the research that you put into this. Um, like you really left no stone unturned. It was so thorough. It was so well researched.
Thanks. That's very kind. Thank
And
you.
I mean, like it's nonfiction. It's very analytical. So my next question, like, do you consider yourself to be a creative person?
Not in the least. I don't.
Interesting.
I don't. I think, I really don't. You should read my fiction. It's horrible. It was a rainy night in Soho. No, I
I don't
don't think.
I as I was gearing up for this conversation, as I was writing my own notes, I kind of had my own like epiphany because outside of music, like playing music, I do a lot of research for this podcast, for writing about music, right? Things like that. And nothing near the research that you do. I'm not going to archives or anything like that. But
Not yet.
I had this not yet, no. But I had this conversation with my wife, kind of realizing that like there is something creative about interpreting music and listening to it and having the audacity to try and capture music in words. And it was an interesting take because what we do with the spill and like your radio show and this podcast, it's nonfiction, and we typically associate nonfiction as not creative. But I was curious if you thought that this was some form of creative exercise in just the act of writing and listening to music.
I mean, I guess stringing the words together and making it readable and presentable. But like, I am such a fan. Listen, I've been reading books since I was 4, and I Stephen King. I've read everything by the Brontes. When I went to U of T, I used to go to the Rare Book Room and read poetry by the Brontes, Dickens, Bukowski. I mean, I love good literature, good writing. I love it. So I would look at my book and go, nope, not even in the same week. And I was at the Beatle Fest, there was a guy named Wally Podzeric, and this is an important person because he wrote a book called The Beatles All Together Now with a guy named Terry Castleman, which was the first serious discography. And I love this book. I mean, I've gone through 3 copies because I've worn them out because I would take them with me to record stores and stuff. And he interviewed me at this Beatle Fest, which was the most intimidating thing. And I said to him, I go, I can't do this. He goes, well, why not? I go, because you're Wally. I'm Aaron. He goes, but Aaron, we're same. I said, no, Wally, we're not. And here's why. And he was saying to me, look, I'm just like you. I did the research. I sat down at a typewriter. I put into type, and he was really good at helping me kind of say, okay, maybe I'm an author, but a writer, whatever you
I mean,
want
you're
to call
definitely an
it.
author. There's a book with your name on it.
Yeah. Well, so but I compare myself to him and think I'm nowhere near his league at this point. Maybe down the road I will be. But he said to me something interesting. He goes, well, maybe there's a 12-year-old kid reading your book going, I want to be like that. And I seriously doubt it, but okay, maybe there is. But you know, because I was that 12-year-old kid reading all together now, and I thought that's what I want to do. I want to write a book about and then there was another book called The Beatles Forever by Nicholas Schaefer, which I loved. And these guys I hold in high esteem. So and it's very hard for me to kind of say, yeah, I'm creative. I don't know. I don't think I'm creative. I think that what I do have is like I just love music, and I hope that comes through in the book. Like
Absolutely.
I just love the music. I really like when I listen to your records, your music. I really now, and it's a genre I don't know a whole lot about, but I listened and thought, oh, this is really good. And oh, maybe, you know what I mean? Like so I'm in awe of anyone who can pick up an instrument and do things with it. Like, not everybody. I'm Ed Sheeran, no thanks. But just really glad, but you know, I'm in awe of that. So I just love music. And if I'm not reading or writing, and I usually write with music on, like it just helps me. Sometimes it's
Mm.
instrumental, sometimes it's, as I said, I listened to all the Dark Horse records as I wrote because I wanted to kind of hear them with different ears, if
Ooh.
that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I just appreciate that you've taken the time to listen and you liked my music. That's so awesome.
Oh, I love it. I think it's great. That's why I want to see you live one day. I'd really like to see you perform. And my timing always sucks. It's Jared, you're playing in a night when I've got tickets for something else or I'm sick. I think I had a hip replacement one night you were playing. It's like I'd love to come, but I'm in the hospital. So there you go.
One day, one day. Um, so it took you three years to write this book.
Yeah,
Now that Dark Horse is out there,
yeah.
how does it feel?
It feels really good. I'll be honest. It's still I'm still trying to get my head around it. I remember the day that a box of books came to my house. My publisher sent it to me, and I thought, oh my gosh, because here's this guy in England. He liked it. He paid for it to get printed up. He designed a cover. It was very emotional. It feels good. It feels nice to see. You said something. I got a book out there with my name on it, and just for a joke, I put it on I have all my Beatle books on a bookshelf. Well, four bookshelves, and I just put it up on the bookshelf with a bunch of
Sorry, is
other
that
Beatles.
four bookshelves of Beatle books or four bookshelves like of books?
Oh, got I tell a lie, 8 bookcases of Beatle books. I've
Wow.
got about 300 Beatle books, give or take.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I put it up there with but I could put my book in with all these other Beatle books and take a picture. So I did, just for me, just for my collection. So that was kind of cool to see your name on the spine of the book. It's like, wow, like you must have the same feeling when you see your music, right?
You know
Like
what?
it's
We printed our two EPs. We had them pressed on vinyl. So side A is I've Got Something to Say, and side B was Reload. And I do have a copy on my shelf with my records, and it's alphabetically in there. And if you're just kind of scanning through, you might just be like one of the one. That's my bit. And absolutely, I completely understand.
so
It's such
it's
a
it's a buzz, right? Like it's really feels
absolutely,
good. And
absolutely.
and that will always be there. That record will never disappear. It'll always be there in some form or another. And you don't know what person listened to your music and thought, I want to do that too, right? So it's the same thing. Like it's really cool. That's why when I write for Spill, like I think someone likes this album and someone's worked really hard at this. I'm not going to write mean review. It may not be my cup of tea, but what's the artist trying to do? And that's what I look for is always, I remember it as a kid, there was a review. I don't like Styx. And Rolling Stone wrote a review for Cornerstone. It was two words, Styx, Styx, Stinks, Stynx. Funny. I would never do that.
Yeah, 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 I get that. I get that. Um, so you're already in the process of writing your next two books. One of them, they're both connected to the Beatles. One of them, obviously, a Beatle,
Yeah,
and the next one, is your interest piqued by the fact that this band was briefly associated through speculation to being the Beatles. Are there other areas of music that excite you that you could see yourself putting in this level of effort to writing a book
I
separate from the
really,
Beatles?
I really want to write a book about the history of Christmas music because it's fascinating to me.
Tell me more.
Uh,
I'm so curious. That was
well,
not the answer I was expecting at all. I was expecting you to pick like an artist
Roxy,
similar to the Beatles. I don't know, like yeah, like Roxy Music or like Dylan or the history of Christmas music. Wow, okay.
it hasn't been written about. And one of the first Christmas records was done in 1935 by Bing Crosby. It was Silent Night, and all the money went to the Catholic Church because he didn't want to profit from doing a hymn. And all of a sudden, the record companies went, "This is selling truckloads. We could make money from this." And all of a sudden, you got secular Christmas albums and Christian Christmas albums and Christmas songs, Christmas parodies, Christmas everything. It's a fascinating topic, and I watched a documentary about some of the writers. I think it was on Netflix or something, but no one's ever documented how did we go from Silent Night to All I Want for Christmas Is You by Mariah Carey? And there's a progression there. So I'd like to write that. I'd like to write a book about Canadian record labels. Again, my love of labels. But I just met a person who owned Aquarius Records, a friend of my wife's cousin, and I said, "Can I interview you?" And he said, "Yeah, that'd be great. Let's get the story down." And then through him, I met a guy named Frank Davies who owned a record label called Daffodil Records. And then I thought there was a really weird Canadian label scene in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Quality Records, Arc Records, things like that. So those are the things I'd love to write about because it's just, again, no one's tackled them. And they're kind of interesting because there are always these really small stories that kind of become big, like who knew April Wine would be big? I didn't. So, or Corey Hart. So, those are the things I like to work on. And that's my next kind of after I'm done these two books, I think those are the two I'm going to focus on. Unless, my publisher says, "Do you want to write a book about John?" Yeah, okay. But
It's
everything's
it's
all about laughing.
it's so interesting that like the two main ideas you have there are just that there's a lack of information about these narratives. Because in my notes here, I have underneath that question, I have what is still in need of uncovering. I don't know, maybe it's just like the fact that you dove headfirst into Dark Horse that I just had a sense that you gravitate towards these areas where the information just isn't there. Is that is it like the challenge that excites you? Is it the intrigue of connecting the dots to tell a story? What about the unknown is what about that captivates you the most?
Kind of all of the above. Like I find it, I also get worried that things are going to get lost. So with the Dark Horse book, I kind of wanted something down that this existed and it was important. It may not be important to everybody today, but it was important in the 70s. And so I look for stories that haven't been told because I get worried that over time they're going to get lost. This is going to sound really out of left field, but I love 1930s and 40s big band vocals and all
Okay,
those.
cool, yeah.
Have a huge 78 collection. And you go through the 70s and there's like dozens of artists that if you do research on them, they were as big as U2 or big as the big, Ed Sheeran. And now you wouldn't even know their name because they've gotten
Hmm.
lost. And I find that's a shame because it's like there's some really cool stuff there that some of the stuff from the 40s, people, Billie Holiday or Bing Crosby or Sinatra, but I just get worried that some of the stuff's going to get lost. And there was this really cool label that I grew up loving called Arc Records, and Arc Records just put out the bizarrest records on the planet. I admire their gumption. It's like, do you really think this is going to sell? Like, do you honestly think this is going to make the top 10? No, okay, maybe it would. I don't know. But they released a single in 1968 by a group called the Abbey Tavern Singers called The Black and the Tartan. And it was a pro-IRA song, which made top 10 in Canada. Like, I'm really a pro-IRA song by the Abbey Tavern Singers on this small label called Arc Records. But there's a story behind that, right? There's got to be something else.
Of course.
Fascinates me. So then, do I like the challenge? Absolutely. Like, I love the mystery. I love the digging up of stuff. I love trying to find all the records and the archives, and it's fascinating to me. And and then I start, I go into these rabbit holes, right? So I'm a thrilling guy at a party.
I mean, I'm having a good time. I think that
this is a great time.
I think that really connects back to what you were saying about wanting to share music with people, right? Especially like lesser known music, things that you may not have heard that are new or under the radar. But I think, there's a degree of that, of going so far back that nobody's talking about this anymore. Nobody's listening or buying this or streaming this, but like it's really cool. And like let's bring it back. Let's unearth that sort of time capsule. I think that's really, really cool.
Well, it's just I had a Beatles show for years called the Beatles Universe. And the whole point of the show was I was playing everything in the Beatles universe. It was an hour a week, and I ran for 6 years. And my biggest thrill was getting emails going, I'd never heard this. Ringo put this out. This is a great song by Ringo Starr. Or I never heard of this Apple artist, Jackie Lomax. Thanks for playing it, because now I can go, find it. And I was excited by that, because it was like people going, yeah, I'll play She Loves You, and I'll play I Want to Hold Your Hand and Hey Jude. But I'm going to throw in some really weird things too that you've not heard before. And not that I think everything should be top 10, but I don't know. I just have such an appreciation for so much different music that I just kind of get excited to play for people. Like, hey, have you heard this? And if you were over here, Jared, I'd be like boring you to tears. Have you heard this one? This is great. Phil Manzanero with, it's like, or have you heard Eno's album with this German band Modus and all that stuff? So that's I'm a nerd.
You and me both. Two final questions. One
Sure.
about Dark Horse. What is it most that you want your readers to take away from your work?
I really want people to take away that George did this for the goodness of the music and to help people. He didn't do it. I mean, sure, he would have loved the albums to go #1, but he really wanted, like we were just talking, he wanted people to know that these bands existed, and he wanted people to hear Shankar. So he'd go on a tour, he'd have Shankar playing with them. He wanted people to hear Splinter. He wanted people to hear, because he loved it. Everything he put out on Dark Horse, he was very passionate about. He loved the music. So he wasn't looking for money or notoriety. He just wanted the opportunity for these unknown artists to get known, or at least give them a foothold. And he did the same thing with Apple Records. If you look at the early days of Apple, he worked with Doris Troy, Billy Preston, James Taylor, Brute Force, Badfinger, and he was just a very giving soul who really tried hard to bring out new music. I'm a big fan of a band from the 80s called Kissing the Pink. And when one of the members went solo, she sent him a tape and she said, do you mind playing on this record? She never met him. And he was like, yeah, I like what you're doing here. Let me play a guitar on it. Use my name, get a record contract. How lovely is that? Like, this guy was really a caring individual who cared about artists getting exposure. So that's what I want people to take away, is that Harrison was as much of a music fan as you and I are. And he just loved music, and he just wanted to it wasn't an ego thing for him. He loved Splinter, for example. He says in many interviews, I just loved the albums they put out. And he loved the attitudes, which gave us David Foster, by the way. He just loved their albums. He thought they were great. So he just every interview you hear about him, he says, I just want people to listen to it. Just give it a chance. That's all. So that's what I want people to take away, is that Harrison was really a caring individual, and really loved the artist he was playing or promoting.
I think that really comes through with your writing.
Oh, I hope
It's
so.
like reading the book. I felt that Dark Horse was, like you said, it was not so much Harrison trying to make a massive label. It felt more curated, right? And
Yeah,
that's the tone that I got from reading the book, which only made me love George more.
yeah, me too. Me too. I fell in love with him. I remember that Derek Green saying to me, he goes, Harrison was very seductive. He said, you'd go in and meet with him, and he was so passionate about these artists. And I think I tell the story in the book where he goes, he plays me Ravi Shankar's new album and says, Derek, we got to get this into the charts. And I walked away going, yeah, we'll do it. I got in my car and kind of went, how the hell am I going to sell Ravi Shankar? So it was that's how Harrison came across, and I just that's what I wanted to portray in the book.
I think you did a fantastic job of that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
On a final note, something that I like closing my interviews with,
Sure.
what are
This should,
your three desert island records?
oh, today,
I
um,
I mean, I guess. I don't know when you're going to be on the desert island.
um, the White Album for sure, because it's never boring. If I kind of separate the Beatles and go other artists, because otherwise it'd just be three Beatles. But uh, I'd have to say "For Your Pleasure" by Roxy Music, their second album, and the third would be Bob Dylan's probably probably Desire, or yeah, probably Desire, but no, Blood on the Tracks by Bob Dylan.
Yeah, that's a great one too.
That's a good
Uh,
one.
I mean, I guess we're gonna cheat on this one because like you are the Beatles expert, but you said you're gonna separate it, and you said like let's branch out from other artists. If it was to be three Beatles albums,
Well, White Album, Revolver, and you're gonna laugh when I say this, and people always get surprised when I say this, but Magical Mystery Tour, um,
was not
which I
expecting that one.
yeah, no one ever does. But side two of that album, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, Baby You're a Rich
It's
Man.
great, absolutely, yeah.
I love side one. I love Blue Jay Way and Magical Mystery Tour. I love that. I love the movie too. I'm one of the few that will defend that movie to the dying breath, but it's a great film.
All right, Aaron. Well, thank you very much for joining me today on Beats by Jer. I had a
This has been,
fantastic
this has
time
been,
chatting.
this has been the best time I've had being interviewed. So thank you very much for
Oh,
making
wow,
this.
that means a great deal to me. Thank you.
Oh, I mean it. This has been the best. Thank you so much, man. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to my conversation with Aaron Badgley. You can purchase Dark Horse Records, the story of George Harrison's post-Beatles record label, through Indigo, Amazon, Sonicbod Publishing, or wherever you purchase your books. As you can tell from today's conversation, Aaron is an absolute wealth of knowledge and now a certified expert on the Beatles. I thoroughly enjoyed reading Aaron's work. Dark Horse Records is a must-read for any Beatles fan as it brings to life a story that had yet to be told, and I would wholeheartedly recommend his book. Once again, I would like to thank Aaron for his time. I greatly appreciated our conversation on today's episode. Tune in 2 weeks for a brand new episode of Beats by Jer. I'm Jared Harris, and this is Beats by Jer.